Welcome to Better Teaching, Only Stuff That Works, a podcast for teachers, instructional coaches, administrators, and anyone else who supports teachers in the classroom. This show is a proud member of the BE Podcast Network, shows that help you go beyond education. Find all our shows at bepodcastnetwork.com. I am Gene Tavernetti, the host for this podcast, and my goal for this episode, like all episodes, is that you laugh at least once and that you leave with an actionable idea for better teaching. A quick reminder, no cliches, no buzzwords, only stuff that works. I am very excited about my guest today. My guest is Doug Lemov, and most of you know Doug from his work. He is the author of Teach Like a Champion. Now it's 3.0 version. And his new book that he wrote with Erica Woolway and Colleen Driggs, The Teach Like a Champion Guide to the Science of Reading. And he also has a book on teaching and learning in sports settings, The Coach's Guide to Teaching. And we had an opportunity to talk about all of these things and how Doug studies high-performing teachers. I think you're going to like this one. I have lots of things that I'd like to talk to you about, Doug. And one of the things that my listeners know is that I'm very interested in literacy for students, not in primary, because even if the science of learning is fully implemented 100% across the globe, we still have a group of kids who missed out.
Yeah.
And so I'd like to talk to you about a lot of what's in your new book. And what's the title of your new book again, Doug?
It's called The Teach Like a Champion Guide to the Science of Reading.
Perfect. And that's what, again, as I was going through that, I just saw so many things. And one of the things that struck me initially was the importance on fluency.
Yeah.
Could you talk about that?
Yeah, I'd love to. Thanks, because it's kind of a hidden epidemic. I will just say that one of the original titles we were toying with for the book was Beyond Phonics. The idea is, what do we know about the science of reading after I think we all agree that systematic synthetic phonics is job number one in the early primary years. Let's assume we win that battle, that we commit to those things. There's still a lot of science of reading, but we know what should happen to students between grades, say, 3 and 12. That's so critically important, and so much of it is overlooked, and fluency is a great example of that. Fluency, I think the best and simplest definition of fluency comes from Mark Seidenberg's really brilliant book, Reading at the Speed of Sight. And that is really what we do when we read fluently. We read at the speed of sight. We recognize the words as soon as we see them. So I think one really fascinating kind of factoid is that you almost can't read printed language in your native language when you see it. You can't not read printed language in your native language when you see it. So if you see a no parking sign, you can't decide not to read it. You've processed it faster than you could decide to look at something and not read it. You'd have to think consciously and think to yourself, I'm not going to read that sign. And by that point, you would have already read it. And that's a really good definition of what happens when we read fluently. We understand the words as soon as we see them, with no load on working memory. And so we can be thinking about things like, what is this text about? What is the mood? What is the tenor of the author's voice, etc.? And I think the interesting thing about this is that we don't really know what the rate of disfluency is beyond grades maybe 3 or 4, because it doesn't get assessed beyond that. But I think we do know that it's probably an epidemic in the middle grades, even into high school. I talked to David Page at University of Northern Illinois. He's one of the leading researchers in the country on fluency. And I asked him this question, which is, if we know that having your working memory overloaded by having to think about the words and what they say interferes with comprehension and insight for text, how many students experience that? And he said, there isn't really any data out there that tells us, how extensive disfluency is. But then we looked at a study together, and we looked in the data tables, and he said, my estimate is probably about half of students in the middle school and high school grades have disfluency issues, and in this, and in communities of need where schools serve them least well, those numbers are probably something like 80%.
So when you think about that, and I think it was in your book, I'm sorry, I've been reading a lot about this lately, that there may not be data, there may not be assessments, but there's just a quick and dirty, assessment in the classroom, just have the kids read aloud.
Well, I do think having students read aloud is such an underutilized and underestimated teaching tool, right? When I ask students to read aloud, first of all, I build their fluency. The way to build your fluency is to practice reading aloud. And the research is really clear that if you practice reading aloud with great automaticity, with greater prosody, which is, infusing the words with a sense of meaning like they would be spoken, then you read internally that way. Your internal voice, when you're reading silently, does that. So you become a better reader. So when we ask students to read aloud, first of all, I think we bring the text to life and make it interesting and we connect to it, but we also build a mental model of what text should sound like to students. So I think it's profoundly important, but one of the other really interesting things that we do when we ask students to read aloud is we learn a lot about their reading, and we find out that suddenly actually they are not. We find, for example, that they're just fluent and they're wooden readers, or they can read simple text relatively well, but when they're presented with something more complex, they're presented with disciplinary writing in sciences, or they're presented with Charles Dickens, who writes 40-word sentences where the subject and the object are 15 words apart, that suddenly students can't read with fluency. And so we know that we need to invest more in helping those students to be able to breathe life into the text when they read it.
Well, and I think you had a tweet today about the importance of teachers reading aloud.
Yeah.
And teachers don't read aloud. And when you're talking about creating mental models of just having a model, how important it is to listen to the teacher. How do we get teachers to do that more? And how do we get teachers not to do it too much?
Well, first of all, I just think we need to conceive of it as a form of teaching. One teacher said to me at a workshop, I'd love to read aloud more with my students, but I live in fear of an administrator coming to my room and asking me why I'm not teaching. And I would just say, let me say, unequivocally that reading aloud with your students is teaching, and a very useful form of teaching. In our book, The Teach Like a Champion Guide to the Science of Reading, there's this really beautiful video of a teacher named Gabby Wolf. She's teaching the equivalent of 10th grade at King Solomon Academy in London. And she's reading aloud to her students from Robert Louis Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which is just, it's a complex book written in Victorian syntax, but such an important book. And she starts by reading it aloud to them. And she's reading it at what I would describe at 90%, 110%. She's reading at 90% of her usual pace, a little bit more slowly so students have time to process the complex words, but 110% of the expression. And so she's prepared to do this, right? You can just see that she's chosen lines to emphasize and to punch. And her reading is like, Gene, there's no other word for it than beautiful. Like, the story is beautiful when it's read by her, and you can tell that the students feel it. So she reads aloud to them for maybe 3 or 4 paragraphs. And then she asks them to start reading. And they take it in little sections of a sentence or two, very working memory friendly, so they can really put their full focus on it. But you can right away, you hear that they're almost mimicking her read, and they're doing their best to bring as much meaning making to the text as she is. And I think this is really interesting. Like, think of all the questions that I don't have to ask you about a text if you read it aloud and in an ironic voice, right? And you show that you understand the irony of the text in the way that you read it. Then I don't have to ask you, is it ironic? Why is that ironic? What might, like, blah, 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 blah. We can just read. And then she says, great, read down to the bottom of the page with your partner and be prepared to answer the following questions. And the room just like explodes to life with the kids just taking such pleasure in reading to it. They're almost like competing to read it as beautifully as they can. And I just think, like, if we, there's this very profound social signal here in kids showing each other that they enjoy the text, that they like pleasure in that they take pleasure in the text, that they're all in for reading this 19th century British novel. And so I think the book is in a death struggle against the smartphone and social media. And if you look at reading rates, students don't read outside of school much anymore, and they don't read many books in school either. And if we still believe in books and the idea that that books matter, that the content of books matter, that in themselves they're important historical artifacts that capture the thinking of humanity across generations, then if we decide that books matter, we have to bring them to life in the classroom in this way that makes them real and compelling and beautiful in the way that Gabby does in this classroom in London.
Doug, let's set novels aside for a second, because I have lots of questions about that for you. But there were 2 things that you mentioned with regards to the teacher reading fluently that I want to emphasize. The first one is, and I saw this, I don't know which one of your books, but an example of the prep in the
Yeah.
teacher's book for
Yes.
when she was going to pause and what words she was going to do. And so all that prep. And then the other part that I want to emphasize is the teacher's reading 2 paragraphs.
Yeah.
Because if I was walking in and I watched a teacher do none of those things, but continue to read for, pages, then I would question whether there was instruction going on.
Sure, valid. Just because something is good doesn't mean it's always good and should be the only good thing that we do in the classroom. So we talk about in the book, so that example of teacher preparation, by the way, isn't at least there is one in our book because we take that very seriously. I think it's a misconception to think that you're just going to walk into the classroom, open up the book, and start reading it in an optimal way that gets all the value out of it. But when we talk about reading in class, we talk about what we call ways of reading, and there are really 3 ways of reading, and neither of them is better than the others. It's like a healthy, balanced diet, right? We want to have a balance of the 3, and the question that we ask teachers in our workshop is, what are the benefits of each and what are the limitations of each? Because they all have benefits and they all have limitations. And the 3 ways of reading are, 1, the teacher reading aloud to students, right? So I read two paragraphs aloud like Gabby does. The second form is students reading aloud to each other, which we call phase reading for fluent, accountable, social, and expressive. Those are kind of the goals of students reading aloud. And then the third type of reading is students reading silently to themselves, independent reading. We describe it in the book as accountable independent reading because we need to know what's happening during that period. But those 3 ways of reading are all different in the value that they create for students and in their benefits and limitations, right? My reading aloud to students is a great thing because I accelerate the rate, because 1, I can build a mental model of what a text sounds like, what Victorian prose, as Robert Louis Stevenson imagined it should sound like. But also I am mainlining for you vocabulary and knowledge information at a faster rate than you can internalize by yourself. So sometimes there are real benefits to it. But obviously there are also limitations, which is students can become passive during teacher reading and they're not actually practicing fluency themselves. And we want, most of the reading that you do in your life is independent reading, so we want to socialize that. So really what we talk about is how do you achieve the balance? What's the right balance to strike between those 3 ways of reading and the other things that you do in the classroom, inserting writing prompts and reflections in the midst of reading. And I would say that the balance is different for every text and for every group of students, but being intentional, if I'm intentional about what the benefits and limitations of those 3 ways of reading are, then I can make better decisions about how much of each, why, and when. And if I bring the text back into the center of the class and we read together, then I can embed other activities in reading optimally. For example, if we're reading and I ask you, where do you see evidence of sensationalism in Stevenson's prose and why might he be including this here? Right, if we've just read 3 paragraphs together, then when we start talking about it, it's fresh in our working memories and we're all remembering the same passage. And so we have a really rich and robust conversation about it. Or if I ask you to write and I say, take 30 seconds to reflect on the nature of the sensationalism in the passage that we just read, and then we'll talk about it, go. Every student is now generating their understanding directly from the text. They're not piggybacking on what other students said. What I'm able to tell is how much they're able to understand directly from reading the text themselves, and I can walk around the classroom and look over their shoulders and see that, Gene is doing great and he understands everything, but Doug can have a great conversation about the book when other people point out to him in moments of sensationalism, but he really can't spot them himself. And so the non-reading tools that I have available to me are more compelling in many ways when we embed them in the experience of reading. If the framework of the class is, we're going to spend a lot of time reading a text together, and there will also be other things that we do as we read it that will enrich the text and enrich my knowledge and understanding.
A moment ago, you talked about, our literature competing with social media and the limited attention spans. I don't know if you mentioned that or I just included that. I just hallucinated that you included.
Yeah, so we actually have a whole chapter on attention in the book because it's such an important issue.
And so is that part of the reasoning behind the brevity of the of these when you're implementing
Yeah,
these things?
yes and no. Actually, I would say in many ways, I think the state of student attention is an argument for for working towards longer periods of text. Or let me start at the beginning a little bit with
Okay.
like, I think one of the things that we have only begun to wrestle with is changes in attention in the American populace, including students, including but not limited to students, which is your cell phone and constant exposure to novel, unpredictable stimulus fractures your attention, right? When there's always something new available to you, you come to expect it and you come to need something new. And there's overwhelming research that when your cell phone is available, when even your cell phone, my cell phone is on my desk right now, turned over, but it's still distracting me to some degree. I think more deeply and can sustain my attention better when it's not there. But after we wire how we fire. I think it's one of the most important phrases in cognitive science, which is if you practice reading in a distracted state, that becomes what reading is for you. The way that we do read shapes the way that we will read. So I have 3 kids and I adore them. I want them to thrive in life. And so when my son was a senior in high school, one of the rules we had was he had to read 45 minutes 3 times a week, because he was a voracious reader, and then he got his cell phone and he really stopped reading. And so I would watch him walk, take a book and go lie on the couch, and he'd be reading the book and his cell phone would be right in the middle of he'd be lying on his back on the couch with his cell phone in the middle of his chest. He starts reading. Bzz. Dude, we're over at Byron's. Can you come over soon? Reads another sentence. Bzz. Dude, that girl in your math class, when are you going to ask her out? Read another sentence. Bzz. Dude, peep this video, super cool. Check out the moves by the point guard, right? His experience of reading the text is fractured. Right? It's not that he's reading less, he's reading qualitatively differently than we would have if we had, or what he would have if he had sat back with the book and lost himself and immersed himself in the milieu of the book for half an hour at a time. And when you read that way over and over again, that becomes internal, that you don't need your cell phone anymore to distract you when your brain is wired for distraction. So one of the things that I think we need to do is wrestle with this so we can give up on attention in the classroom. And I think there are people who argue that we should do this, that we shouldn't read books anymore because they're too hard and you can't get students to attend, and we should show videos instead, and we should pander to fractured student attention. And I think that we argue the opposite, which is reading is attentionally demanding. The ability to harvest your own attention is one of the most important skills we get out of school. So one of the reasons to read in the classroom is so that we can curate the attentional environment to rebuild students' attentional skills, right? The cell phone has taught us that attention is malleable. And if we set out to read for 5 minutes on the first day, and then 10 minutes, and then 20 minutes, increasingly over the course of the semester, I can build my students' capacity to focus their attention. And that might mean 5 minutes of me reading aloud, 5 minutes of them reading together, 10 minutes of really engaged and motivated reading silently. That's still 20 minutes of like unbroken attention in the text. Or it could mean 2 minutes of me reading aloud to you and then 18 minutes in the text. But my goal should be to help students be able to sustain significant periods of attention in text. And I think maybe there's a balance to how I do that, but so shifting between the means of the ways of reading can help me to engage students in text and cause them to be engaged and therefore want to attend more. But I think my goal, interestingly, should be long chunks of sustained reading by students. That one of the benefits of bringing reading into the classroom is that I can curate the reading environment so that if students are going to wire how they fire, that I can curate the environment so they're used to reading for sustained periods of time with optimal focus and attention.
I think one of the implications of what you just said, and maybe it's just because I want it to be this way, this is what I heard you say, is that just like training an athlete,
yes,
you're going to train for a marathon. You don't run 26 miles the first day. You just continually build up. Are you saying you believe that we can do the same thing with reading and attention by asking for a shorter period of independent reading and then adding to it?
Yes, exactly that. I think we use the word stamina for exactly that reason, which is you build up your stamina, you build up your capacity to run miles, and also we should recognize that we have to build it up intentionally. And we should also recognize that you can read Runner's World all you want to about different training regimens and different ways to structure your
Right.
marathon
Yeah.
training.
Yeah.
But it comes down to your road miles and whether you can have the discipline to put in the miles on the page. And you start small and you build up to it, but you have to build up. And the ultimate goal is to be able to, is to have the stamina to run long distances or read long distances.
And so when you're asking students to do independent reading and you're asking them to do that accountable reading, then there are questions, there are things that you're asking them to guide their thinking. Is almost like questions in annotation, or am I getting too deep?
No, you're not at all. I think annotation is a hugely important tool. And by the way, I think this is an argument for like reading in hard copy text. And one reason for reading in hard copy text is so you don't have a screen, because we know that screens distract us because we're socialized to being distracted when we're on screens, and we remember more when we read in hard copy. But the other reason to read in hard copy is that you can annotate. So I can say, let's say, just to go back to like, I'm reading Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. This is a really hard book. I should not assume that students who are good readers with other texts will be understanding what they're reading when they're reading silently in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, because it's really arcane, challenging, complex Victorian text with obscure syntax and, et cetera. So maybe I say something like, read down to the bottom of the page, and in the margin, make note of the way that Danvers Carey is characterized, write a quick description in the margin to describe, his primary characteristics, or underline the key scene where the where the plot shifts, right? And then I cause you to focus on these things. And I just think having an attentional focus for reading causes students to be more productive readers. But then I can walk around and look over your shoulder and assess, Gene's description of the character is pretty accurate, and Doug's is wildly off base, and he's reading, but he's not understanding what he's reading. And so before I say read the chapter on your own, I should say read 2 pages on your own, and I should just try and assess the degree to which you're able to read it autonomously, successfully. And annotation, I think, is one of the key tools that I would use to do that. I could also ask you questions about it, but annotation is really efficient as a tool, and it also has the ancillary benefit of just shaping students' attention. And I think that, attention, because it's invisible and mostly subconscious, is something we just overlook the power of it as a teaching action, just shaping students' attention, pay attention to. In this Gabby Wolf video that I'm describing from London, she says, as you're reading, pay attention to the ways that Stevenson is sensationalizing certain actions, right? And that causes students to notice it more.
Well, the way you describe, annotation, the way you just described it and the way you describe it in your book, again, it's getting kids to focus, and you make a distinction and you contrast that type of annotation to general annotation. Okay, which words do you not understand? And what's a question here? What do you think? And again, I think the difference between teaching and reading the book, it is because the students don't know all those aspects that you want them to attend to.
And I think that there is a place for, we sort of talk about directed versus undirected annotation, right? Underline the places where you see examples of sensationalism on page 68 versus make note of anything you think it's important on page 68, right? Those are very different annotation tasks. I think they're both legitimate. I think that in some ways, the way that I teach you to pay attention the most, if I engage in directed attention tasks, I teach you to become a better reader and maybe pay attention to important things that you might not otherwise pay attention to. So maybe early in the book, there's a lot of directed attention tasks. Pay attention to this, focus on this, make note of this. And then as we proceed through the book, you start to understand what's happening more. I've helped shape your conception of it. Then maybe the second half of the book is whatever, make note of anything that you think. And when I know that you're able to read it successfully, independently, and we've practiced it enough that I know that now you're picking up what Stevenson is putting down, now I say, make note of whatever you think is important. And then I can ask, what did you think was important? And you can talk about anything that's interesting to you. I just think the assumption that as the starting point has some flaws.
Okay. Boy, okay. So you just said, when we get to the second half of the book, all right, let's go back in history a little bit. And I kind of want to shift to talking about novels, because, I was in school at a time when we were assigned to novels. I'm not going to say I read them, but I know that they were assigned. And this was quite a while ago. So kids not reading, doing the reading is no new phenomenon. But what I think was new when I saw the shift and I was no longer a student was when we began to have the high stakes testing and, kids were assessed on discrete skills that were really the text was kind of agnostic. And so we started doing more test prep, not test prep, teaching to the test, which I believe is a good thing if the test is good.
Yeah, I
But
agree.
it just eliminated the time to do the
Yeah.
novels. So how do we over the time thing? This is what I'm asking.
Well, novels do take time. There's no doubt about it. And I'll talk a little bit about. So I agree with you that the belief that reading is comprised, that reading comprehension is made up of a set of transferable skills that I can practice and master, is complicit in the decline of the book. Which is if I believe that that the purpose of the text is to ask you main idea questions or character inference questions, and that reading is really the ability to answer and ask questions about the text. It doesn't really matter what text I'm reading or the length of the text that I'm reading. And I think that contributes to the development of assessments that are generally poor. But I also don't think I think it's easy to sort of say that it's the cause of assessments that are doing this. In England, if you want to go to college in England, you have to take the GCSE in literature. And the GCSE in literature requires that you read a Shakespeare play, a 19th century novel, and a collection of poems, right? So assessment doesn't have to be content agnostic, and it doesn't have to take a simplistic and unscientific view that reading is made up of transferable skills. I think one of the points we make in the book, probably over and over, is that this transferable skills model is not backed by science, that when we make inferences and we understand a text deeply, it's because we have the knowledge to understand the text, and that it's a beautiful idea to think that if you taught me that the main idea is what the passage is mostly about, and we chanted that a few times, and I outlined for you the 7 different steps to finding the main idea of a passage, and we spent 45 minutes trying to find the main idea of a single passage, that you would then be able to find the main idea of any passage. That is a beautiful dream, but an entirely unscientific dream, because because when you can't find the main idea of a passage, it's not because you don't understand what you're trying to do. It's because you didn't understand things like the background knowledge or the vocabulary or the syntax. And so I'm really wasting my time when I do that 45-minute lesson. I'm wasting a lot of time on that, and I'm killing the text. And that a much better thing to do would be to take Gabby Wolf's model and read the text aloud together and bring it to life and infuse it with background knowledge and make sure that students understand the vocabulary. So I think there are a lot of forces that are complicit in the de-bookification of American English classrooms. One is that our assessments are really poor. One is this sort of belief in the skillsiness of reading, which I think is deeply unscientific. And one is the decline of attention, and maybe our unwillingness to confront that decline of attention. But we feel really strongly that books are important, and an education is incomplete without the reading of books.
I'm imagining you're doing a training with secondary teachers, and they say, "Oh, this is wonderful, Doug. How long should it take to get through a novel if I'm reading a paragraph and they're reading 2 sentences and they're..."
Well, I think that's the interesting thing, first of all, I think, I think the last decade has been a disaster for American schools. One of the points of disaster has been this argument that students should not do homework anymore. I think that there should be homework. One of the things you need to do to be able to get through a book in a timely manner is ask students to read some of it at home and to hold them accountable for it. And so one of the very small but useful sections of the book is how to make a reading check in the morning, so you can test whether kids actually did the reading the night before. And if I do that, then I think you should spend about 6 weeks on a great book. It's probably worth it. And that probably influences your balance of reading aloud to students, and students reading silently is a little bit faster than them reading aloud together as a group. So if I have to move, sometimes I'm gonna read maybe slightly longer sections to you, and then say you read the rest in the last 10 minutes of class and finish it for homework. Whereas if I have a slightly shorter book, I have a little bit more time, I might do more of this phase reading when we read aloud together as a group. So I think that's one of the factors I have to balance when I think about ways of reading. And I have to be able to, at least in high school when we're reading, To Kill a Mockingbird, there's going to have to be some reading at home. Otherwise, that's all we're going to do for the first semester.
When I hear you say that teachers don't think they need homework anymore, I'm not sure that's the belief. I think the belief is the kids aren't going to do it. And so we acquiesce. And I think we're doing the same acquiescence now with regards to technology. Like this is how the students this is how they spend their time. This is how they would prefer.
Right.
They want to be on screens. So we're going to be on screens. We're going to gamify everything because this is who the students are. Yeah. And it's kind of funny. I guess it's kind of analogous to chemotherapy, killing everything, to cure the cancer. But I don't know the answer.
Well, I don't want to put these things at the feet of teachers because I think teachers are often beholden to a system that socializes behaviors or pushes them to do certain things or doesn't back them when they do hard things that are beneficial. But the purpose of education is not to make students happy, right? The classes that I got the most out of, that I learned the most from, I was not the happiest in. I just think there's become this narrative in the last 10 years that my job is to do the things for students that students want to do. First of all, people are not, the research is overwhelmingly clear that people are not especially aware of when they're learning, and their perception of when they're learning is different from when they're actually learning. So even if I ask students, did you think you learned a lot? They're probably wrong. But second of all, who is my client? My client as a teacher is the parents of students, the parents who send their children to school in the belief that the school will do the best to help them accomplish the things that will cause them to thrive and succeed in life. And I'm really grateful to every teacher that I had who caused me to work harder than I wanted to work in high school and in middle school and in college. Like, left to my own devices, would I have optimized? But of course not. There's actually a fairly long tradition of young people not being able to see the future and not making long-term optimal decisions. And one of the things that schools are supposed to do is socialize students to do those things and cause them to do things that they don't necessarily want to do. So if my students say, I don't want any homework, should I give them homework anyway? Yes, I should. It should be really good homework. It should be well-designed homework. It should be efficient homework. It should be productive homework. A lot of this quote research on homework shows that really crappy homework doesn't help very much, but really good homework does help a lot. And especially if I hold students accountable. And I just think that if we're serious about serving students and their families, then we need to wrestle with that. We need to wrestle with that. How do I make not just homework, but more productively things that students aren't sure that they want to do at first useful to them? And I would just say that I just finished reading a book that a bunch of people had recommended to me. It was Ian McEwan's book, Atonement. I don't know if you've read that. It's supposed to be one of the classics of the 21st century. I was like, why was I not informed? Okay, a couple of people recommended it to me. I read it. Gene, for the first 60 pages, I did not like them. It's not that I didn't I just wasn't into the book at all, and I wanted to stop. If I'm honest, I wanted to stop reading it. And I was doing this thing that I do with myself sometimes where I'm counting the pages. I'm on page 56, I'm on page 58, I'm on page 60, I'm on page 62, I'm on page 164, I'm on page 208. It takes some time to enter the realm that a book creates for you. It's hard work. It requires cognitive patience and cognitive endurance, a lot like running. But when you're forced to do it, you are happy. I'm so glad I read that book. By the time I got to the end of it, I was so glad that I persisted in those 60 pages when I wanted to give up, because it was incredible and it made me see things that I wouldn't have seen in any other way. I say this to my kids all the time. No one, when they're spending their evenings looking at YouTube videos, I don't think nobody gets to the end of an evening of scrolling through content on the internet and thinks, I'm really glad I spent the evening scrolling through cat videos and point guard videos on the internet. You wish that you'd gone for a run. You wish you'd gone to the gym. You wish you'd played guitar. You wish you'd read a book. But you need external factors often to cause you to have the self-discipline, not just to do what's in your best interest in the long term, but to teach yourself the cognitive endurance to find higher, more gratifying and more valuable forms of enjoyment that take time to get to. And that, again, is why I think, all the teachers who assigned me to read, I still remember, in ninth grade, I had to read Walden Pond and The Scarlet Letter. Did I want to read those books? Absolutely not. Did I do everything under the sun to avoid reading them? But, my teacher, like, she hammered us and she gave us quizzes and she held us accountable. And by the end of those books, I was so glad that I'd read them. And I'm so glad that now, and to this day, I'm so glad that I read them.
I could go on and on asking you about literacy. I mean, it's
Sure.
such a big issue. But as I told you before we started recording, I have other things that I want to ask you that I'm so interested in. And,
Let's go.
And one of them is about your work with coaches. And I know you have you wrote, and again, I'm sorry, I don't have the title.
The Coach's Guide to Teaching.
Coach's Guide to Teaching.
Yeah.
Tell us, and you're now living in England.
I probably spend about a third of my time in England. I'm in upstate New York, but I spend a lot of time in England. So yeah.
Oh, okay.
Partly, I guess you could say. I try to convince my wife to move to England sometimes when I come back because I enjoy it over there.
But you were actually, asked to work with some professional sports teams on coaching and learning. What was that? What was it like being asked to do that? And then what was the work like? And what are some of the teams, if you don't mind mentioning?
Yeah, it's so fascinating, incredibly fascinating. I'm incredibly humbled to be asked. And at first, when I started doing this work, I kept it a secret from people in my office because I was like, public education is the most important thing in society and it's kind of on fire. And I'm spending 20% of my time, on a lark working. I have 2 NBA teams that I work with and a Premier League team that I work with and a couple of national rugby teams and national sports teams that I work with, national sports federations. But I couldn't really keep it a secret from my staff because I'd come back to the office and I'd suddenly start telling a story about something that I'd learned, working with a sports franchise that was so relevant to teaching. So I think there are lots of things that we know about teaching and learning in the classroom that are relevant to what learning looks like for a sports franchise. But there are also a lot of things that coaches do that are relevant to teachers. So I'd say that there are 2 kind of bodies of work that I do. The first one, Gene, you could probably do this in a heartbeat. It's the average professional athlete spends more time in the classroom than they do on the field or on the court. So if you play in the Premier League and, you can only practice so many minutes and the number of minutes you can spend on the pitch, those are determined by the sports scientist guy, and 58 minutes into practice, no matter what manager you are, if you're Pep Guardiola, if you're Mikel Arteta, if you're Ruben Amorim, someone walks on the field and says, that guy has to come off. He's maxed on his minutes. And so they seek competitive advantage by spending a lot of time in the classroom. They don't call it the classroom, but it is a classroom, right? They're showing video to players of this is what Aston Villa's back 4 look like. How will we attack them? Or, this is how we want to attack them. This is what our shape should look like when we're playing in transition. And the presumption is that players will learn that and apply it on the field. And I think that generally speaking, the teaching in that setting is not very good. The first question I usually get is, how long can a meeting be? And the reason I get this question is because the meetings are brutal for the players. The manager stands at the back of the room and shows 12 videos in a row without asking anyone any questions, and says, everybody got it? Good, right? And of course, they don't get it. They haven't seen everything. The manager's watched the video 6 times before he showed it to the players. And he shows it to the players, and he knows that it's a video that demonstrates the defensive spacing of the opposition, but the players aren't watching for that yet. And unless they're caused to engage in the video and watch it actively and answer questions about it, they're probably not learning as much as they could from it. So we talk a lot about, how do I optimize the learning in that environment? And then how do I think about, just because I understand a video, I show you a video and you say, great, so when we attack this team, we want to do X, Y, and Z. I could answer all the questions correctly and describe my role and everyone in the team's role in the video room, and whether that transfers to the field 30 minutes later in practice or 3 days later in the match. That is a very different question. Incredibly cognitively demanding to do, right? The video that you're showing me is shot from a 40-degree angle from the top of the stadium, 200 yards away. And you're asking me to recognize the same visual cues when I'm standing at field level with 50,000 people screaming at me, having just made a mistake, right? So just because I understand it in the room doesn't mean it transfers to the pitch. So that's one thing that we often talk about, is just how to optimize learning in this, in video environments. And then I just think there are a lot of things that happen on the field that we talk in the field and on the court that we talk about that influence learning. What is the design like retrieval practice? Retrieval practice is incredibly important in the classroom. It's incredibly important on the court too, right? There's almost nothing that you can master in a single session durably as a player and have it transfer to the match in a single interaction. So I have to be thinking about retrieval practice and causing previously understood concepts to come back into working memory if I want players to understand them. And designing those sorts of things into training, we talk a lot about things like that. So, and maybe I'll just say one other thing that I think is one of the things that's transferred back from the sports world to the education world for me most is the profound influence of perception on decision making. In the sports world, where your eyes go determines your capacity to make a decision, right? You can't make a decision about something you don't perceive. So a lot of the training for an athlete, well, what we talk about often is socializing players' eyes, right? Like a better question than like, Gene, what should you do? You have the ball, you have the ball at the top of the key, should you dribble drive or should you pass, right? Like, what should you do here? A better question is, Gene, what do you see? What do you notice? What cues should you be looking for to decide if you should drive or pass? Because if you're not looking at those things, right, you don't even know if you don't notice that your teammate is open on the wing, if you don't notice that there's space under the basket, you won't make the right decision. So shaping players' perception is often the first step in shaping their decision making. But because perception is a subconscious activity, we're not really sure what we're looking at. It's often overlooked. And interestingly, I think this is a huge factor in classrooms, which is a teacher can't make decisions about something that she doesn't notice, right? So directing her eyes to to pay attention to what are the signals that students are sending you. Do you see if they understand or if they don't understand? Do you observe, are you scanning the room to observe for follow through in your directions? That shaping, anytime we want to shape decision making, the first thing to do is to shape perception. And I just don't think there's much. I think in the teaching world, we overlook how central the art of observation is to the craft of teaching. And so we now in our workshops do a lot on, shaping teachers' perception, their looking behaviors in the classroom.
It's interesting. I'm thinking of two things as you're talking about, like the film study. Mm-hmm. I didn't hear you say, after 30 minutes, let's have them slant.
No, yeah. That's interesting. I mean, generally speaking, we're talking about, well, I think this is really interesting. Most players are highly motivated. They're getting millions of dollars, right?
Yeah.
But you would actually be surprised at the potential non-productive behaviors in those meetings and how much time is, and how important it is to optimize player attention in those meetings. Players don't always know how to do what's beneficial to them. So attention is relevant. Yeah, you don't see a lot of slanting, but we do talk about the physical environment, right? Because look, if you put your head down in a meeting on an NBA team and you're looking out the window or you're fooling around in a meeting, like there's someone else who wants your job and it's not going to be very long before they take it. There are some exceptions to that. Like the NBA is really interesting. There's 5 players on the court. You have a dominant player, and like to some degree, like the coach has to take some direction from that player because that player is so important. In soccer, there are 11 players. In rugby, there are 15 players. Like one dominant player is not that important. They're very dominant in the NBA, and you can have a non-productive presence from your dominant player, and that can be a real team issue. But for the most part, you're going to get checked if you're non-productive in meetings. Yeah.
Well, and then the other side of that, I think we're going to tie all of this together, Doug. The other side of that is.
I'm sorry if I'm meandering, but
no. I love coaching. I was a football coach, and I can't not tie it to the classroom.
Yeah.
So when you talked about the issues that students, let's go back to the classroom for a second, and the issues with social media and phones and everything, it also applies to these professional players. Huge they have the same thing. So in the classroom, we talked about teachers going to read 2 paragraphs. Kids are going to read 2 sentences. We're going to try to increase their stamina, regardless of their paychecks. They're not doing this because they don't want to. I think what you said, they don't know what to pay attention to.
Yeah.
And so it's not Okay, I'm gonna change topics again, Doug, and feel free to use coaching, feel free to use
Yeah.
whatever. Okay, because you mentioned retrieval, we're talking about attention. You know, I am seeing now in folks who are really teachers, folks being teachers who really want to become better teachers.
Yeah.
They're having to go out on their own to learn things that we talk about in science of learning.
Yeah.
And they go back to the classroom and they try to implement these things. I had one teacher I'm working with, his name is Joe Finch. He was wonderful. He had this term, and he says, I have Frankenstein lessons. I do all of these techniques,
Yeah.
but the lesson structure wasn't there. And that's one of the things I've noticed I have about Teach Like a Champion. A lot of folks will quote Teach Like a Champion and all the resources that you have and videos and your website. And, it's wonderful. But nobody ever says, oh, I design my lessons like Doug says. That
Right.
it's like the one chapter or three chapters, whatever you have in that. It's just like it doesn't exist. But
Yeah.
but I do all of these strategies.
This is a really interesting question because I love and respect teachers and love and respect their decision making, and I think all teachers are different. And so my intention in writing Teach Like a Champion was to make it a toolkit, which is always, I chafe a little bit at systems that say to teachers, you have to throw out everything you do and like this is the system for all your lessons. I prefer, here's some tools that you can use to help become the best version of yourself. And so you decide which tools you want to emphasize, or maybe within it, someone suggests to you, your administrator suggests to you, you really need to, there needs to be a way to hold students more accountable in the classroom and make them think harder. So here's a set of tools. You should be more writing intensive. Here's some tools to help you be more writing intensive. But I think one of the challenges of Teach Like a Champion, one of the weaknesses of that model is that lesson structure does matter. I mean, we have a section on some lesson structure stuff, but like I'm writing a book right now about direct instruction because direct instruction is really important to be good at. It's really powerful. It's widely misunderstood. And it is not just like a toolbox of like, in this moment, try this instead of that. It is structure your lesson this way. It's a little bit more structurally prescriptive. I think a lot of people think about Teach Like a Champion as like prescriptive and formula. I think that to me, that's a misreading of the book.
Yeah.
But I think that my next book will probably outline more of how to use the model of direct instruction more effectively, because sometimes the whole model matters.
I know many times, for the past 20 some years, I've been providing training on explicit instruction. And many times, I'd be introduced and the principal or district administrator.
Gasp when you said, explicit instruction.
Pardon me?
Would the room gasp when they said, here's Gene to talk about explicit instruction? Like,
they never mentioned that. They never mentioned that. They didn't say that, especially after Common Core. Mm-hmm. But anyway, I'm being introduced, and the principal or district administrator, who's ever there, is saying, okay, Gene's here today to give you some more tools for your toolbox. And then he would introduce me. Yeah, and then I would say, I really love, your principal, and I'm glad I'm here, but this is not tools for your toolbox. This is the toolbox. Yeah. This is what contains all of these good strategies that you guys are using. And now we're going to show them where and how they're going to be most effective. And so I'm with you. That always bothered me because, it's always like, this is optional. There are some things that the evidence is clear is more effective, now. And I also think of it as the artistry. I always think of middle school teachers being as goofy as the kids, and I'm saying that in the most positive way. I'm
a recovering middle school teacher too.
Yeah. You don't want to take that personality out, but there's still room within this framework of space to be able to continue to be yourself.
Yeah. I think a lot of things, maybe just like three quick points. What you said about like, there's still room to be able to be yourself. That's always been my belief about the techniques, which are similar to tools in Teach Like a Champion, which is when we do a workshop, I never show one video of a technique because I want teachers to see theme and variation so they can use the idea in a way that is in keeping with with their own style, right? Teachers are different. Some teachers are introverts, some teachers are extroverts, some teachers are funny, some teachers are, straight.
Yeah.
So I really believe in that. And I think that the way that I've tried to solve the problem that you're describing about, which is the synergy of tools, is to rely on the cognitive science to build a mental model for people of what learning looks like. And I think that this is the single biggest difference between England, their school system is thriving and rising up the league tables, and the US, where I think we're in a crisis, is that in England, teachers reliably understand working memory, its limitations and its importance in the classroom, the connection between background knowledge and higher order thinking, right? They understand cognitive load theory. A head teacher in England said, you almost can't find a newly qualified teacher who does not understand the basics of how cognitive science works. When you have a good mental model of what learning looks like, you make you make better decisions with tools. I think the research on that is clear, how important mental models are. So like in Teach Like a Champion 3.0, the whole first chapter is like a mental model of learning. What does learning look like? How do we know when it's happening? Now use these tools in keeping with that. That's an effort to get at cohesiveness. But I still agree with you that there are times when there's a greater level of cohesiveness required, and that having a system like explicit direction instruction is you don't always have, it's still flexible when you have a system, but it's important. And I think that's something I spend a lot of time thinking about, and I think we'll probably address in my next book. Because I think there are times when, you can't be a teacher and not be able to use explicit direct instruction at some point to achieve understanding for your students.
Okay, Doug, I'm going to put you in time machine. Okay. And send you back in time, and you are hiring teachers for when you're in charge of your school networks and school leadership. Here's four areas. And if you were hiring or starting to train somebody, could you rank these? What you just mentioned was understanding science of learning, how we learn, lesson design, which we just discussed, curriculum, or a teacher's content knowledge, and a teacher's content knowledge. Is there any, could you rank them, or is it a fool's errand?
Mental model of learning through cognitive science, lesson design, content.
Curriculum and content knowledge, yes.
Oh, I say content knowledge and curriculum are separate.
Yes.
Okay. Well, here's the thing. I think all these things are immensely important. But I would say that the first two, I should be able to train you on. I should be able to teach you those things relatively quickly. And if I can't teach them to you and if you're hungry to learn and open-minded, and I can't teach you those things as a school leader, then that's on me. So I think they're profoundly important, but I think they're within the realm of a school's capacity to develop those in people. And I think there's like a real joy and power in developing them together. Like teaching is a lonely profession. We get together on Fridays and we learn about cognitive science. Like that's a great thing. I don't think that I can teach you background knowledge, knowledge of literature or science or history, and that I think I have to hire for that. And so that's that. I would say if I have a learning modality, if you're eager to learn, like our hiring process when I used to run a network of schools was, you would come in, you would observe for the day, we'd chat a little bit. If we liked you, we'd invite you to teach a sample lesson. You'd teach your sample lesson and we'd give you feedback on your sample lesson. If you were hungry to learn and you were wrote down the feedback and asked really good questions, we would say, come back and teach another lesson. And if you came back and you taught your lesson and it was better, I was buying. Because, if you can give you feedback on a lesson, you can improve your lesson right away. Then if we can't make you great, then we are doing something wrong. So we were hiring for that, and we were hiring for background knowledge, because that I can't, in a series of Friday PDs, teach you a lifetime's knowledge of chemistry. Like that is something you have to come in the door with, and I think it's easily overlooked. Curriculum, I think, is kind of curriculum is the ability to write and design curriculum is totally different from the ability to teach And I think teachers are asked to do both, and it's probably unsustainable to do both. They're certainly very different skills. You could be a great teacher and a poor curriculum designer. You could be a great curriculum designer and a poor teacher. I think one of the next hills for us to conquer in American education is that, generally speaking, we should be providing teachers with really good curriculum, daily lesson plans. It doesn't mean you can't change them, right? If you're a great teacher, I'll give you a lesson plan and you can you've taught in my school for 3 years and I know you're brilliant. Here's a model so you don't have to plan, so you can go home to your own family and be a mom or a dad to them. And you can spend your time thinking about how you adapt it. But if you want to change the lesson and do something different, great, God bless you. But if you're a first year teacher and I show you here's how Colleen taught this, she's a brilliant teacher, and you're I think I'm going to blow this up and do it. And wait, you hold on there, slugger. You do 6 weeks of Colleen's lessons and you internalize how she thinks about things, and then we'll talk about whether you want more autonomy. So I think just because we have curriculum with daily lessons does not mean I think there can be different levels of autonomy and decision rights granted to teachers within that curriculum. And to me, that's kind of one of the key decisions of an administrator is what are your, how much autonomy and decision rights are available to you as a teacher? But I think schools should supply curriculum to teachers. One of the things we read about in the book is how profoundly important background knowledge is to reading comprehension. So if I'm reading a book, we're reading Number the Stars, beautiful 5th or 6th grade novel set in Denmark during the Nazi occupation. The way to bring that book to life and cause students to understand more is to embed small nonfiction passages about 100 things that students don't know about, but knowing more about will help them to read the book. They should know about Nazi beliefs and ideology and how occupations worked, and they should understand resistance movements, and they should understand rationing, and they should understand the psychology of reality testing among small children, because the character Kirsty is very small and she doesn't understand things that are happening around her that are obvious to her older siblings. And so each day there should be little pieces of nonfiction writing that help bring the text to life and help me understand more about it. That is a really hard thing for a teacher to do, to go find 3 or 4 really interesting short nonfiction passages and then adapt it. It's unsustainable. So someone should do that for you and give them to you, and then you can be today I'm going to skip this one. I'm going to make this one a little bit shorter. I'm going to add a little bit to this one. I'm going to ask some extra questions about this one. That's lesson preparation. That's different from lesson planning. And I think that schools should provide that to teachers so they can focus on the craft of teaching and master that craft. So to your 4 things, I'd say interestingly, background knowledge is the one that a good school can't provide. So that's the one that I think you have to put first. Well, I'd say assuming that someone is hungry to learn and understands the basics of pedagogy and is willing to do that and willing to take direction, and you're willing to say, look, here's how we want you to do it. If they have a learning modality about pedagogy, I should be able to teach you those things. I should be able to provide you with the curriculum you need. I can't provide your lifetime's background knowledge on chemistry. Just not going to be able to teach you that.
So people couldn't see, listeners couldn't see, I was smiling really big when you said that you can do science of learning and lesson design relatively quickly. And then other things they got to bring with them, and other things you can develop. But I wanted to hit on the thing that you said, where I was smiling was when you said we can do this relatively quickly. Because I think one of the things that
relatively being the operative word, but okay.
Exactly. Yeah. But I think understanding that there are different timeframes for different things that you're doing in your PD, because I hear, schools that want to do something differently. I've had more than one school tell me this, Doug. Ask them, so what are you doing instructionally? They say, well, this year, every teacher is going to have a learning objective. And I'm thinking, that's it? That's what you're doing? Well, we have to go slow. Not on that. That doesn't make any sense to anybody, Right. So
I would say that should happen by the end of September.
Yeah. I mean, there are some things that you can go more quickly on, and some things, it's going to take a little bit longer to turn this ship. But so I agree there. Doug, man, I could talk to you forever. You have any questions for me?
I do. I have one question. Well, I have lots of questions for you, but I'll ask. We probably have time for one. So you were asking about England, where I do spend a lot of time, and I feel really optimistic for England schools because, as I was saying, I think there's been this sea change in the teaching workforce's understanding of cognitive science and their expectations of their own professional knowledge, that you just You go to a room of teachers in England and you start talking about working memory and long-term memory and knowledge and direct instruction, and people know what you're talking about. And then we can talk about applying it. And in the United States, learning science still means learning styles, which I think most, cognitive scientists would agree has been like debunked for years, and is probably focusing on learning styles probably degrades learning in a lot of cases. So there's this problem in that the average teacher in England understands cognitive science, and the profession in the US has not caused this sea change to happen for teachers. What would it take in your mind? What are the factors that would is it possible that we could achieve this kind of sea change in the next 5 to 10 years in the US and have the average US teacher know 5 times as much about cognitive science and understand how learning works, so they have a mental model in their minds when they're teaching and making decisions that make them learning optimal? What would it take to cause that to happen in the US? Is it possible?
Well, I'm going to have to start paying royalties to Helen Reynolds. I don't know if you know Helen, because for those of you who don't know, Helen left the UK, a very well-respected educator in the UK, came to the United States and taught for, I think, 7, 8 years before retiring here. And I asked her, what's the difference between, teaching in America, teaching in the UK? She said, well, I tell my friends from the UK, just imagine this, that every time you suggest something to an American, just imagine that they're saying, you can't make me do anything. And I think that's the first thing. I think part of it is in our nature. Part of it is just in the expansiveness of the country. I know folks, from the UK come over who are consultants, and they want to, garner part of the market in the United States, and they can't, it's beyond them, the scope and how
The decentralization of it is
decentral. Yeah. I mean, everything. So I think part of it is just in our culture. Nobody's going to make us do anything. But I think the other thing is that, we're all in, just like we have political silos, we have these educational silos. Mm-hmm. And every time somebody talks about, science of learning, I always say, oh yeah, I'm in that cult, and then I'm in this cult as well. And so part of that, you have, each cult has their dogma, and it's difficult to cross-pollinate. And I think there's one other thing, and that is, just like, we have education celebrities, just like we have pop culture celebrities, and they have a shelf life. I mean, at any particular time in the past, I could go into a principal's office, in anywhere in the state of California, and they'd have the same 2 new books. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Everybody would have it. They wouldn't read them. It wasn't read, but that's what we're doing now. And I think, I don't know if we're ever going to be able to do it, because I know in the 74, they did an article recently just about what you said, how far the, UK was ahead of us. And I told them, and I didn't make the article because I told them we were doing this in 2006, and now it's gone. And it just, with, again, churn, it's just a new generation, and the way our administrators are trained. And I told you I was not a very good teacher. I was an administrator, not a very good administrator. But it was, what are we doing new now? And so I wish I had an answer. I'm not hopeful. One other factor is that I remember learning some of this, the science of learning stuff. And I thought, I wondered, I still had, I don't know if like you, I don't know if you do this, I would save my textbooks from college. And so I went back like 30 years after I'd had this course in Ed Psych, and there was a small paragraph on something, And so when you're doing teacher prep, to be successful in our teacher prep programs in the United States, you need to be a successful student.
Yeah.
You don't need to be a successful practitioner.
Yeah.
So I think part of that has to change, because I could sit in a class. It's just like what you said. It's not about reading one Runner's World. It's about going out and doing the work. Yeah. So I know all the problems, Doug. I have no answers.
On that optimistic note.
Well, you know what, Doug, I just appreciate the work that you do because I think it's the hard work. It's the hard work working with the teachers and providing online resources in addition to, your books. All your books have, links to exemplar videos that folks can watch. And like I say, I just appreciate all the work you're doing to make these things available to teachers. We don't have to wait for a PD.
Well, thank you. I'm glad if it's useful, then I'm happy, and I appreciate your saying so.
All right, Doug, any last words for folks?
I think I probably rambled on enough to, if anyone's still with us now after, my long perorations on life in the NBA. It's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Hey,
it's been a
my pleasure. Thank you, Doug.
Opportunity. Okay, cheers.
If you're enjoying these podcasts, tell a friend. Also, please leave a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. You can follow me on Blue Sky at G Tavernetti, on Twitter, X at G Tavernetti, and you can learn more about me and the work I do at my website, tesscg.com. That's TESSCG.com, where you will also find information about ordering my books, Teach Fast, Focused, Adaptable, Structured Teaching, and maximizing the impact of coaching cycles.